name is David Griffith, and I serve Chautauqua Institution as Vice President and Emily and Richard Smucker Chair for Education. It is my honor to welcome you to this afternoon's program with the Honorable Rosalie Silberman Abella. Support for this lecture is provided by the Robert H. Jackson Lectureship Fund, which has provided a Chautauqua lecture on the Supreme Court of the United States for the past 13 seasons. Please join me in thanking the Jackson Center for making this lecture possible. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Q. Barrett back to the Hall of Philosophy to introduce Justice Abella.
Thank you so much, Dave and friends. It's always a great pleasure to be at Chautauqua and to have the opportunity to be part of a conversation with each of you. My role, which is brief, is to touch on three topics: Robert H. Jackson, this Chautauqua Institution lecture, and this year's lecturer. Now, many of you already know a fair amount about Robert H. Jackson. He was born south of the state line in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania in 1892. Family moved into New York State. He grew up in Frewsburg and then became a law apprentice, a very young lawyer, and a legal force in Jamestown. After 20 years in private practice, where he had risen to state and national stature at the bar, and also had involvements in Democratic Party politics, he went to Washington as a New Dealer in 1934. And across the next 7 years, he was nominated 5 times and confirmed by the Senate 5 times to high executive branch offices: the Bureau of Internal Revenue in the Treasury Department, then Assistant Attorney General, then Solicitor General of the United States, then Attorney General of the United States, and then Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you, Franklin D. Roosevelt. At the top of that very steep escalator, Jackson was all of 49 years old. But what's interesting about Jackson, and we'll talk more about other marks he made, was that he didn't have much formal schooling. He graduated from the Frewsburg High School. He had done 1 postgraduate year at Jamestown High School, and then he had become, through the apprenticeship path, a lawyer with only 1 year of legal education at the Albany Law School. In other words, he never went to a day of college in his life, and he only spent 1 year in law school, the year he was 19 and turned 20. A meteoric rise that background would not permit today. So how did Jackson become Jackson? Well, a lot of it was in his genes, and some of it was in his family, but a fair amount of it was Chautauqua Institution. You see, Robert Jackson was a Chautauquan. In the 15-year-old boy in the back listening to William Jennings Bryan sensitive, and in the years ever thereafter, becoming a friend of Arthur Bester and a member of the Inner Circle Advisors, the person who brought Franklin Roosevelt here in 1936 to deliver the I Hate War speech, which bailed out Chautauqua during the Depression and prevented bankruptcy, and from many Chautauqua podiums, Jackson himself, a Chautauqua speaker. It was in his bones, it was in his blood, it was in his brain, and it really raised him. So how appropriate for Chautauqua Institution to feature and carry forward the memory of its son, Robert Jackson, through this annual lecture. That brings me to this year's lecturer, Justice Rosalie Silberman Abella, who is here, I will note, with her husband, Dr. Irving Abella, a professor of history emeritus at York University and president of Canada's Academy of Arts and Humanities. Justice Abella is here as a jurist, a justice, one of the 9 who serve on the Supreme Court of Canada. She is a leading jurist and legal figure, not just in Canada, but globally. She is a pioneer, she is a pathbreaker, she is a sharp pen, she is a strong voice, she is a clear conscience and an inspiring life and figure. Some of her path-breaking was her very young appointment in the mid-1970s as one of Canada's first female judges, and the first ever to be pregnant when she was appointed. A path-breaking Jewish judge, service on the Family Court, then the Court of Appeals, and since 2004 on Canada's High Court. Now, Justice Abella, of course, did not know Robert H. Jackson, but I will note an interesting geographical overlap. Briefly, both were in the same part of the United States. You might say. And let me clarify. What I mean is the United States sector of military occupation in the land that had been Nazi Germany until it surrendered unconditionally in May of 1945. And she'll take it from there. Justice Abella does know the U.S. Supreme Court. She is a close student of its work. She is a consumer of its work product. She obviously has a particular vantage point and an understanding, and she also has personal relationships with the people who serve on our high court. So she is uniquely positioned to speak of it and to offer us some timely and topical and comparative thoughts from her vantage point as a justice of her nation's Supreme Court. I'll also note that it is a special new milestone to have, for the first time, a Supreme Court justice delivering the Robert H. Jackson Lecture on the Supreme Court of the United States. So no further ado, great pleasure and honor, Justice Rosalie Abella.
And one of the shortest justices on the Canadian Supreme Court. Well, this is wonderful. Thank you all for coming out. I said to John, my amazing host with Greg Peterson at the Jackson Center, who is going to come out to hear a Canadian judge? And he said, you don't know Chautauqua. These are wonderful people, and on a sunny day you do have alternatives, so I really appreciate the fact that you're here. And I take the sunshine, which was not predicted. We looked at the weather forecast before we drove in from Toronto, and it said 3 days of thunderstorms. So I take this as a sign of good relations between Canada and the United States. Jackson grandchildren are here. You know, as a grandparent, it means so much to me to know that the legacy survives in generations that follow. I never met your grandfather, but I think you'll see through this lecture that in a way our lives intersected in actual and ineffable ways. I am a Canadian. That means I'm very polite. So to be a judge in my generation is to be an admirer of Robert Jackson. To be a Supreme Court judge in my generation is to hold him in inspirational awe. His judgments are the best written I have ever read. Literate, compelling, poetic, and rigorous. They reveal the intellectual textures of a wise philosopher, the cerebral interest of a polymathic scholar, and the heart of a compassionate statesman. What I would say they reveal transcendently is a judge whose passion is the search for a moral universe in which justice flourishes. And so that is what I have taken as my overall theme in today's lecture in his honor. To paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe may be long, but does it always bend towards justice? This year marks not only the 50th anniversary of the assassination of King, it's also the 70th anniversary of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Two international beacons, which in my view are the direct outcomes of what Robert Jackson helped reveal at Nuremberg. So part of my lecture will also wander into how moral the global universe is. Let's start with Michael Frayn's play, Copenhagen, where morality and justice play out through a fictionalized account of what happened at a real meeting in Copenhagen in September 1941 between two Nobel laureates, Niels Bohr and his former student, the German physicist Werner Heisenberg. The meeting took place in Bohr's home. Together, the two men had revolutionized atomic physics in the 1920s with their work on quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. I tell you in the privacy of this room that when I first saw the play in New York with my husband, I turned to him and I said, couldn't you get tickets to My Fair Lady? I don't understand any of this. I actually went out and bought the play because everyone told me it was a really good play, and when I had the text in front of me, I got it. So the moral question at the heart of the play is what Heisenberg's duty was as a loyal German and as a scientist in charge of its nuclear program. Was he obliged to help protect Germany by developing the atomic bomb? Or was he obliged to protect the world from Germany by sabotaging its production? The atom bomb, as you know, was never developed in Germany, and the play never makes it clear whether this was because of Heisenberg's deliberate derailment of the German atomic project or a result of just getting the calculations wrong. The genius of the play is the way it plays on the tensions between the mentor, Niels Bohr, half Jewish and living self-consciously and proudly in occupied Denmark, developing nuclear expertise for the Allies, and the acolyte, Werner Heisenberg, working conscientiously and proudly for the occupier and the honor of German science. Both scientists blame themselves and each other for perceived breaches of their moral responsibilities as scientists. Bohr for coming to America, where he worked at Los Alamos and played what he called his small but helpful part in the deaths of 100,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Heisenberg for working for a crazed dictator. I found the most interesting speech in the play to be Heisenberg's explanation for his ambivalence when he says, "We have one set of obligations to the world in general, and we have other sets, never to be reconciled, to our fellow countrymen, to our neighbors, to our friends, to our family, to our children. All we can do is look afterwards and see what happened." The point of the play isn't what actually happened at the meeting between Bohr and Heisenberg, because no one really knows, but about what it tells us about how we make moral choices and how the context of the moment may not be a sufficient defense in history's court. Let's start the conversation about our moral universe with the term rule of law, the holy grail of democratic discourse today, and the one everyone invokes to justify the legitimacy of their views. I confess I've always been somewhat confused by the use of the term rule of law as an organizing principle. Beyond students of scholars like Joseph Raz, H.L.A. Hart, and Ronald Dworkin, I think the debate between positivists who see the rule of law as procedural and those who see it as one with substance is lost on most lawyers, let alone members of the public. Universal principles to which most of us are expected to give aspirational loyalty should not be shackled with semantic ambiguity. After all, this generation has seen the rule of law impose apartheid, segregation, and genocidal discrimination. It frankly makes me wonder why we cling so tenaciously to the moniker. So what are we really talking about? We're talking, I think, about some universal goals: ensuring limitations on arbitrary state power, protection against rule by whim, and about our belief in law as an instrument of procedural and substantive justice. And if I'm right that that's what we're really talking about when we talk about a just rule of law, doesn't that mean that what we're talking about is what we come to see as the indispensable instruments of democracy? Due process, an independent bar and judiciary, protection for minorities, a free press, and rights of association, religion, and expression, for example. Those are core democratic values, and I, for one, am not the least bit embarrassed to trumpet them. Because when we trumpet those core democratic values, we trumpet the instruments of justice. And justice is what laws are supposed to promote. And I think we need to emphasize again and again that when we talk about democracy, we're not just talking about elections and majorities. To say democracy is only about elections is like saying you don't need the whole building if you have the door. Elections tell democracy it's welcome to come in, but elections are only the entrance. Without a home, democracy can't settle down. It needs an edifice of rules and rights and respect to grow up healthy and secure. So shouldn't we be out there promoting the universalism of democratic values, the instruments of justice which emerged triumphant from World War II with the help of Robert Jackson, instead of a euphemism like rule of law? We need the rule of justice, not just the rule of law. I know democratic values are no guarantee, but they're the best goals, because without democracy, there are no rights. Without rights, there's no tolerance. Without tolerance, there's no justice. And without justice, there's no hope. What kind of rights are we talking about? Two kinds. And this is a difficult concept I find in America. Human rights and civil liberties. Both crucial mainstays of the democratic catechism, and both at risk from neglect. What's the difference? Civil liberties is about treating everyone the same. Human rights is about acknowledging people's differences so they can be treated as equals. Civil liberties is only about the individual. Human rights is about how individuals are treated because they're part of a group. Civil liberties is a concept of rights that requires the state not to interfere with our liberties. Human rights, on the other hand, can't be realized without the state's intervention. But we have to start at the beginning of the story. The rights story in North America, like many of our legal stories, started in England. He doesn't agree. Wait, there's more. Let me explain. They let dogs in from Washington, D.C. I know, I believe in free entry. The rampant religious, feudal, and monarchical repression of 17th century England inspired new political philosophies like those of Hobbes, Locke, and eventually John Stuart Mill. Philosophies protecting individuals from having their freedoms interfered with by governments. These were the theories of civil liberties which came to dominate the rights discussion for 300 years. They were also the theories, as you know, which journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean and found themselves firmly planted in American soil, receiving confirmation in the Declaration of Independence, which guaranteed that every man enjoyed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government existed only to bring about the best conditions for the preservation of those rights. And thus was born the essence of social justice for Americans. The belief that every individual American had the same right as every other American individual to be free from government intervention. To be equal was to have the same right. No differences. Neutrality. Leading, as we saw in Masterpiece Cake Shop Limited, to approaching the right of a baker to refuse to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage, the same as the right of a baker to refuse to put homophobic biblical messages on a cake. Or, as Anatole France Riley observed, leading to the rich and the poor having the same right to sleep under bridges and steal bread. Unlike the United States, we in Canada were never concerned only with the rights of individuals. Our historical roots involved a constitutional appreciation that the two cultural groups at the bargaining table, the French and the English, could remain distinct and unassimilated, and yet theoretically of equal worth and entitlement. That is, unlike the United States, whose individualism promoted assimilation, we in Canada have always conceded that the right to integrate, based on differences, has as much legal and political integrity as the right to assimilate. Where for others, pluralism and diversity are fragmenting magnets, for Canadians, they're unifying. Where for others, assimilation is a social goal, for us, it represents the inequitable obliteration of the identities that define us. Where for others, treating everyone the same is the dominant governing principle, for us, it takes place alongside the principle that treating everyone the same can result in ignoring the differences that need to be respected if we are to be a truly inclusive society. Integration based on difference, equality based on inclusion despite difference, and compassion based on respect and fairness. Those are the principles that to me form the moral core of Canada's national values and the values that make us the most successful practitioners of multiculturalism in the world. I gratefully had nothing to do. But I bask in its glory. That is why, for example, Canadians find somewhat problematic the view that all speech should be protected regardless of content, on the grounds that, as I understand it, it promotes the marketplace of ideas. To Canadians, that's a theory that sees no distinction between yelling fire in a crowded theater and yelling theater in a crowded fireball. Sometimes hateful and vitriolic speech silences those it targets, especially if they're vulnerable, with the result that far from promoting healthy conversations, it promotes toxic monologues, a marketplace of idea. In Canada, unlike the United States, we respect freedom of speech, but we do not worship it. In any event, the individualism at the core of the political philosophy of rights articulated in the American Constitution, ascribing equal civil, political, and legal rights to every individual, regardless of differences, became America's most significant international export, and the exclusive rights barometer for countries in the Western world. Concern for the rights of the individual monopolized the remedial endeavors of the pursuers of justice all over the world. It was formal equality, it ignored group identities and realities, and indeed regarded collective interests as subversive of true rights. It wasn't until 1945 that we came to the realization that having chained ourselves to the pedestal of the individual, we've been ignoring rights abuses of a fundamentally different and at least equally intolerable kind. Namely, the right of individuals in different groups to retain their different identities without fear of the loss of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. It was World War II which jolted us permanently from our complacent belief that the only way to protect rights was to keep governments at a distance and protect each individual individually. And what jolted us was the horrifying spectacle of group destruction, a spectacle so far removed from what we thought were the limits of rights violations in civilized societies that we found our entire vocabulary and remedial arsenal inadequate. We were left with no moral alternative but to acknowledge that individuals could be denied rights not in spite of, but because of their differences, and started to formulate ways to protect the rights of the group in addition to the individual. We had, in short, come to see the brutal role of discrimination and invented the term human rights to confront it. So we blasted away over the next several decades at the conceptual wall that had kept us from understanding the inhibiting role group differences played, and extended the prospect of full socioeconomic participation to women, non-whites, indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and those with different linguistic and sexual identities. And most significantly, we offered this full participation and accommodation based on and notwithstanding group differences. Civil liberties had given us the universal right to be equally free from an intrusive state, regardless of group identity. Human rights had given us the universal right to be free from discrimination based on group identity. We needed both to have justice. And we got them, slowly and incrementally in the decades after World War II. So let's take Heisenberg's advice and look afterwards to see what happened to the moral arcs of justice in those decades. In the 40s, the world and North America experienced and survived cataclysmic war. A nuclear bomb was dropped, ushering in the generation of fear. A Holocaust extinguished 6 million Jewish lives and destroyed many more. The public danced, swooned, and fantasized to Benny Goodman, Irving Berlin, Duke Ellington, Count Basie. People read The New Yorker and Walter Lippmann, listened to Churchill, and talked about Eleanor Roosevelt. Japanese Canadians and Americans were disenfranchised and dislodged. We learned or redefined the words genocide, nuclear age, war criminal, refugee, and those twin diametrically offensive doctrines, communism and fascism. Morality was vindicated through war crimes tribunals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. But where was justice in practice? It was lurking. It was lurking behind the Jewish refugees denied entry into our two countries, the impoverished blacks, the ignored disabled, and the unemployed minorities. The women's movement after the war entered 20 years of relative quiescence, no less preoccupied with reunion and rebirth than anyone else, and prepared to delay implementation of its articulated objectives until the nation and they were restored to normalcy. The first half of the decade was spent waging war, the second half recovering from it. In both cases, there was little energy or political will left to undergo the kind of introspection that would have disclosed the remaining inequities. It was a war that left the world tired, angry, and vengeful. A world that saw justice as the equal right to recuperate. If ever we have experienced a period of innocent banality, the decade of the 50s comes closest to claiming the title. It was a time of restoration, of Dwight Eisenhower's benign demeanor and governance, of waves of new immigration, of economic growth and hope, and undaunted by the menacing semantics and reality of John Foster Dulles and the Cold War, undaunted by the spectacle of Joseph McCarthy's insufferably arrogant masquerade and his legacy of human devastation, undaunted by the absence of minorities and women from the institutions and waterholes of power, North America settled into peace with vigor and set about to rebuild its traditions and families with single-minded perseverance. It was a 10-year sigh of relief which fostered and prized predictability and discouraged change. The public still read The New Yorker, but added to its cultural repertoire Ralph Ellison, Bill Haley and the Comets, I Love Lucy, June Cleaver and her son Beaver, Sid Caesar, Harry Belafonte, Norman Mailer, and Elvis Presley, about whom one cynical music critic was heard to say when he died, good career move. And where was justice during these non-interventionist and non-intervenable years? It was poking its nose out from behind the curtain of calm contentment where it had been doing daily 20-minute workouts to prepare for its supporting role on the stage of the 60s. It ventured not very far in the 50s, not because its constituents were any less disadvantaged, but because it knew that in the 50s, justice meant treating everyone the same, an unpalatable placebo to those who needed more, but an intractable panacea for those who had or felt they could get enough. And so it's contented itself with one stunning court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, and rehearsed its lines for its more visible role in the next decade. Justice in the 60s played conscience. We awoke from our sleep of the 50s with a trajectory of energy. We welcomed the exuberance and youth of John Kennedy, who made all things seem possible, watched in trauma night after night as McLuhan's global village invaded our living rooms, unfolding the horrors of Vietnam, agitated over Lyndon Johnson, stirred to the eloquence of Martin Luther King, cringed at the vitriol of the Black Panthers, and in Canada embraced the celebrations of Pierre Elliott Trudeau and watched Quebec liberate itself from ecclesiastical restraint. In the 60s, we demonstrated, rebelled, brooded, spawned flower children, and questioned basic assumptions. People smoked rather than drank their way into tranquility. Burned down urban ghettos, occupied universities, put a man on the moon, and assassinated leaders. We listened and gyrated to the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Mamas and Papas, Bob Dylan, and Chubby Checker. We shifted cinematic focus to Jane Fonda, Sam Peckinpah, and Ingmar Bergman. The main musical was Hair. We howled with Allen Ginsberg and deadpanned with Andy Warhol. We were existential, Jungian, Freudian, nihilist, primal, and in touch with our feelings. We learned our buzzwords from Tal Wolfe, Khalil Gibran, Arthur Schlesinger, James Baldwin, Sartre and de Beauvoir, Camus, and Jack Kerouac. We still read The New Yorker, but we didn't admit it. And where was justice? It was everywhere. It was in the ponytails and flowers men wore. It was at the Washington Monument. It was at teach-ins, love-ins, and sit-ins. and it was on the psychiatric couches of the nation. It was incendiary in Watts, explosive at Kent State, and gentle in Haight-Ashbury. This decade was our confrontation with introspection and tradition. In this decade, we set in motion a revised timetable and agenda and confused ourselves utterly. But out of the turbulence and confusion came a Civil Rights Act, affirmative action, and an awakened consciousness. It was not an easy time, but it was a necessary catharsis. It reminded us that nothing and no one is certain, and provided a rigorous training course in human relations. We were made to pay attention to our children, our minorities, our women, our values, and our insensitivities. Justice as prodding conscience played its part trenchantly and poignantly, and we were never the same again. Just as the 60s hosted breathtaking and seemingly uncontrollable activity, the 70s hosted debate. We started the decade with Watergate and Kent State. We learned from Spiro Agnew, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and Sam Ervin that democracy was an unquenchable public thirst, that presidents dissemble and resign, and that the public demands no less respect from the law than it gives, and that it tolerates nattering nabobs no less among its elected officials than those officials tolerate from the public. In Canada, we were reciprocally petulant with Trudeau and responded to the terror of the FLQ with a mass exodus from Quebec. It was the flowering of the media, visual and print, and confirmed once and for all that good investigative journalism and television could be handmade into democracy. We witnessed a turning point in terrorism with the Munich massacres and felt our economies held ransom by oil and OPEC. In assessing our fallibilities, we held forums on ecology, nuclear disarmament, communications, women, pollution, resource development, technology, and the law of the sea. We were intrigued as Jane Fonda's then husband ran for the American Senate and Richard Nixon ran for governor. We reveled in the partnership of Paul Newman and Robert Redford, the naked insolence of Burt Reynolds and Streakers, the dry irony of Jack Nicholson, and the bravado of Francis Ford Coppola. We were starting to admit that we were reading the New Yorker, but now added for credibility John Updike, Saul Bellow, Maya Angelou, David Halberstam, Betty Friedan, Margaret Atwood, The New Republic, Ms. Magazine, and Esquire. We warbled with Johnny Cash, Barbra Streisand, and Dionne Warwick and discovered the discotheque. We were not shy, but we were apprehensive. We could not walk and chew gum at the same time. As for justice, it was no longer a 20th century adolescent. It matured into young adulthood, cleaning up the environment, reforming the law of the family, renewing the women's movement, galvanizing Indigenous people and persons with disabilities, admitting droves of women into law and medical schools, and acknowledging sexual orientation and harassment. It was the era of equal opportunity and tokenism. By now, no one dared articulate intentionally discriminatory remarks, and the right went underground, or clothed itself in the respectability of neoconservatism. It was a time of hopeful dialogue, and in retrospect, a time of innocent vitality. With the 80s, under the suspicious but respectful gaze of Ronald Reagan's unique aura, justice arrived. But so did Phyllis Schlafly, Iranian hostages, barbarians at the gate, and Sylvester Stallone. The lines in this decade became clearly drawn as justice and fundamentalism asserted competitive claims to superior ideologies. Both sides abandoned their timidity, donned the confident gloves of legitimacy, and entered the ring to try to win the minds of a dubious public. And sitting restlessly in the audience were terrorism, apartheid, nuclear weapons, famine, toxic waste, poverty, free trade, cancer, AIDS, and Dr. Ruth, determined to wait it out and make their respective pitches, regardless of which side won. We colored our hair purple, did diets and aerobics, marveled at Dolly Parton and Michael Jackson, loved E.T., hated the yuppies we became, and wondered about Madonna, and we still read the New Yorker. By the 80s, we had swept into the aggressive fold those minorities for whom other decades lacked energy or time, and they joined issue with other justice seekers to fuel the machinery that could guarantee the permanence of justice's vision. But what we experienced in the 80s was a tension created by a generation old enough to remember the purgatory of the 60s, and now fully recovered through the exegesis of the 70s to be wistfully nostalgic about the traditions of the 50s. I think what the 80s did was leave us shell-shocked. The extremes were so profound, the demands so intense, the solipsism so destructive, that we felt helpless to approach the factions and fractiousness that started the 90s. We were drained, and we seemed to run out of patience. The national conversation became a series of monologues and harangues, and nobody was listening anymore. We forgot what the issues were, so we didn't know what questions to ask. And because we didn't know what questions to ask, we couldn't figure out what our common objectives were. And because we couldn't figure out what our objectives were, we couldn't figure out what strategies we needed to get there. That didn't improve in the 90s, the last decade of the century, the decade of deficit reductions, Beavis and Butthead, globalization, Seinfeld and Microsoft, the decade when we didn't ask and didn't tell, and the decade when we stood by our man, the president, but spent over $60 million trying to find out if he'd had an extramarital affair. Something a good matrimonial lawyer could have done for half the money. We appear to take at face value Yogi Berra's suggestion that when you come to a fork in the road, take it. I would argue that we seem to stall in our justice journey as the last century was winding down. And what we appeared to do, having watched the dazzling success of so many individuals and so many of the groups we previously excluded, was conclude that the battle with injustice had been won, and that we could, as victors, remove our human rights weapons from the social battlefield. Having seen women elected, appointed, promoted, and educated in droves, having permitted parades to demonstrate gay and lesbian pride, having started to recognize our shameful treatment of Indigenous people, and having constructed hundreds of ramps for persons with disabilities, many were no longer persuaded that the diversity theory of rights was relevant anymore, and sought to return to the simpler rights theory in which everyone was treated the same. And so we started to dismissively call a differences-based approach political correctness, or an insult to the goodwill of the majority and the talents of minorities, or a violation of the merit principle. Somehow, as the 20th century ended, we started to let those who had enough say enough is enough, allowing them to set the agenda while they accused everyone else of having an agenda, and leaving millions wondering where the human rights they were promised are, and why so many people who already had them thought the rest of the country didn't need them. The essence of their message was that there was an anti-democratic, socially hazardous turbulence in the air, and that this was most notably evident during judicial fights. And as a judge, this was something I paid particular attention to. The critics made their arguments skillfully. They called the good news of an independent judiciary the bad news of judicial autocracy. They called minorities seeking the right to be free from discrimination special interest groups seeking to jump the queue. They called efforts to reverse discrimination. They trumpeted the rights of the majority and ignored the fact that minorities are people who want rights too. They said courts should only interpret, not make law, thereby ignoring the entire history of common law. They called advocates for equality and human rights biased, and defenders of the status quo impartial. They said judges who strike down legislation are activists unless they disagreed with the legislation. They claimed a monopoly of truth, frequently used invectives to assert it, then accused their detractors of personalizing the debate. Significantly, they want judges to be directly responsive to public opinion, particularly theirs, without understanding that when we speak of an independent judiciary, we're talking about a judiciary free from precisely this kind of influence. As Lillian Hellman once said, I will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions. Public opinion, in its splendid indeterminacy, is not evidence, and it's not law. It's a fluctuating, idiosyncratic behemoth, incapable of being cross-examined about the basis for its opinion, and susceptible to wild mood swings. In framing its opinions, the public is not expected to weigh all relevant information, or to be impartial, or to be right. The same cannot be said of judges. People elect legislators who enact the laws they think the majority of their constituents want them to enact, and appoint judges who are expected to be independent from those legislators and the majority, and impartial in determining whether the legislature's actions meet the requisite standards. That's why they're judges. Time, not public opinion, will always be the ultimate judge of how well judges fulfilled their duty to protect the public's rights. And time, too, will judge the governments of the day for their willingness or unwillingness to contribute to public respect for the judiciary's independent responsibility to patrol the borders between legislative action and the public's right to rights. There is no doubt that the public's views have and should have a seat at the justice system's table. What they do not have and should not have is a veto. Judges who do their job properly in a democracy not only have the right to disregard the majority's opinion, they have a duty to do so if it conflicts with legal and democratic principles. Independent judges who are not politically compliant are not anti-democratic. They're doing their job. And if judges don't do their job fearlessly, neither human rights nor the democracies they serve have a chance. Yet here we are in 2018, trapped in many parts of the Western world, in a frenetically fluid, intellectually sclerotic, rhetorically tempestuous, ideologically polarized, and economically myopic discourse that is clamoring for our attention. It includes, notably, an intense verbal whirlpool about judges and constitutions and rights, a conversation in which loaded phrases are perpetually spun and important concepts are conveniently disregarded. The most basic of the central concepts we need back in the conversation about judges and democracy is that democracy is not, and never was, about the wishes of the majority only. What pumps oxygen no less forcefully through democratic veins is the protection of rights through independent courts, notwithstanding the wishes of the majority. And that brings me to the final part of my talk, the fragility of democracy in too many parts of the world, where democratic institutions and values are thrown under the bus, victims of political expediency and global indifference. And here too, I invoke the moral inspiration of Robert Jackson. Our generation has seen the most sophisticated development of international laws, treaties, and conventions the world has ever known, all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. But we've also had, among others, the genocide in Rwanda, the massacres in Bosnia and the Congo, the repression in Chechnya, the child soldiers in Sudan, Zimbabwe, China, Myanmar, Pakistan, Syria, Iran, Putin, Darfur, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, among many, many others. And of course, the refugees dying by the hundreds as they seek refuge from the wrath of African conflicts. What's going on? And what do we need to think about to fix it? And fix it we must, because unless we pay attention to intolerance, the world's fastest growth industry, we risk losing the civilizing sinews that Robert Jackson flexed in the world's muscles after World War II. Is it time, perhaps, to hold a Bretton Woods conference on human rights and democracy? abuses occurring in some parts of the world are putting the rest of the world in danger. Because intolerance, in its hegemonic insularity, seeks to impose its intolerant truth on others. Yet for some reason, we're incredibly reluctant to call to account the intolerant countries who abuse their citizens, and instead hide behind silencing concepts like cultural relativism, domestic sovereignty, or root causes. These are concepts that excuse intolerance. Silence in the face of intolerance means that intolerance wins. What happened? After 1945, the global community demonstrated an enormous capacity for constructing legal systems and institutions to enhance and advance international rights. Through the UN Charter, the peoples of the United Nations determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women. The UN was created for the purpose of achieving international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all. But the human rights revolution that started after and because of World War II seems to have too few disciples in the countries that need it most. What happened to the miraculous regeneration and luminous moral vision that brought us the Universal Declaration, the Genocide Convention, and the Nuremberg trials, those phoenixes that rose from the ashes of Auschwitz and roared their outrage? The world was supposed to have learned 3 indelible lessons from the concentration camps of Europe. 1, indifference is injustice's incubator. 2, it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. And 3, we must never forget what the world looks, how the world looks to those who are vulnerable. And all this because Robert Jackson said in his opening address at the Nuremberg trials, "The wrongs we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." To me, as you know, this is not just theory. I am the child of Holocaust survivors. My parents spent 4 years in concentration camps. Their 2.5-year-old son, my brother, and my father's parents and 3 younger brothers were all killed at Treblinka. My father was the only person in his family to survive the war. He was 35 when the war ended, and my mother was 28. As I reached each of those ages, I tried to imagine how they felt when they faced an unknown future as survivors of an unimaginable past. And as each of our 2 sons reached the age my brother had been when he was killed, I tried to imagine my parents' pain in losing a 2.5-year-old child, and I couldn't. After the war, my parents went to Germany, where my father, a lawyer, taught himself English. The Americans hired him as a defense counsel for displaced persons in the Allied zone in southwest Germany. In an act that seems to me to be almost incomprehensible in its breathtaking optimism, my parents transcended the inhumanity they'd experienced and decided to have more children. I was born in Stuttgart on July 1st, 1946. A few months after the Nuremberg trials, and came to Canada with my family in 1950, a few months after the trial ended. In Canada, my father was not allowed to practice law because he was not a citizen. That's when I decided to become a lawyer. I was 4 years old. I had no idea what it meant to be a lawyer, but I felt that if he couldn't be what he wanted to be, then I would. I call it the revenge of the refugee. I never asked my parents if they took any comfort from the Nuremberg trials, which were going on for 4 of the 5 years we were in Germany until we got permission to come to Canada in 1950. I have no idea if they got any consolation from the conviction of dozens of the worst offenders. But of this I'm sure. They would have preferred by far that the sense of outrage that inspired the Allies to establish the military tribunal of Nuremberg had been aroused many years earlier, before the events that led to the Nuremberg Tribunal ever took place. The 1933 Reichstag fire decree suspending all portions of the Weimar Constitution, the expulsion of Jewish lawyers and judges from their professions that same year, the 1935 Nuremberg laws prohibiting social contact with Jews, or the brutal rampage of Kristallnacht in 1938. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to any one of those events would have been, at the very least, public censure. But there was no such world reaction. By the time World War II officially started, on September the 3rd, 1939, the day my parents got married, it was too late. And so the vitriolic language and venal rights abuses, unrestrained by anyone, turned into the ultimate rights abuse, genocide. And millions died. And 70 years later, we still haven't learned the most important justice lesson of all, to try to prevent the abuses in the first place. All over the world, in the name of religion, national interest, economic exigency, or sheer arrogance, men, women, and children are being murdered, abused, imprisoned, tortured, and exploited. So, lesson number one, not yet learned. Indifference is injustice's incubator. The gap between the values the international community articulated and the values it enforced is so wide that almost any country that wants to can push its abuses through it. No national abuser seems to worry whether there'll be a Nuremberg trial later, because usually there isn't. And in any event, by the time there is, all the damage that was sought to be done is already being done. Does this raise questions about the effectiveness of the United Nations as a deliberative body? It should. We have to first acknowledge that many of the UN's agencies have achieved great success in a number of areas, like peacekeeping, shelter and relief to refugees, and the World Health Organization. But the UN was the institution the world set up to implement never again. Its historical tutor was the Holocaust, yet it seems hardly to be an eager pupil. What was never supposed to happen again has, again and again. Over 90 years ago, we created the League of Nations to prevent another world war. It failed, and we replaced it with the United Nations. The UN had 4 objectives: to protect future generations from war, to protect human rights, to foster universal justice, and to promote social progress. Its assigned responsibility was to establish norms of international behavior. Since then, 40 million people have died as a result of conflicts in the world. Shouldn't that make us wonder whether we've come to a point where we need to discuss whether the UN is where the League of Nations was when the UN took over? I waited for years to hear what the UN had to say about Syria. Isn't that magisterial silence a thunderous answer to those who say things would be a lot worse without the UN? Worse how? How many more shocking images of needlessly bewildered, wounded, and murdered children do we have to see before our conscience kicks in? Isn't that what World War II was fought to end once and for all? I know the UN is all we have, but does that mean it's the best we can do? Lesson number 2, not yet learned. It's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. In a world so often seeming to be on the verge of spinning out of control, can we afford to be complacent about the absence of multilateral leadership, making sure the compass stays pointed in the most rights-oriented direction? Nations debate, people die. Nations dissemble, people die. Nations defy, people die. Lesson number 3, not yet learned. We must never forget how the world looks to those who are vulnerable. Those are the 3 lessons the world forgot in World War II. And what do those 3 lessons represent? Democracy, human rights, and justice. And what does forgetting them risk? Nothing less than our humanity. My father died a month before I finished law school and never lived to see his inspiration take flight in his daughter's love of the law. But he never for a moment gave up hope, because living in a democracy made him feel safe. A few years ago, my mother gave me some of my father's papers from Germany. In those papers, I found the answer to why he always spoke so respectfully and appreciatively of Americans. I saw letters from American lawyers, prosecutors, and judges that he worked with in the U.S. zone in Stuttgart. They were warm, compassionate, and encouraging letters, either recommending, appointing, or qualifying my father for various legal roles in the court system the Americans had set up in Germany after the war. These Americans believed in him, and as a result, they not only restored him, they gave him back his belief that justice was possible. One of the most powerful documents I found was written by my father when he was head of the displaced persons camp in Stuttgart where we lived. It was his introduction of Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to visit our DP camp in 1948. He said, "We welcome you, Mrs. Roosevelt, as the representative of a great nation whose victorious army liberated the remnants of European Jewry from death and so highly contributed to their moral and physical rehabilitation. We shall never forget that aid rendered by the American people. We are not in a position of showing you many assets. The best we are able to produce are these few children. They alone are our fortune and our sole hope for the future. As one of those children, I am here to tell you that the gift of American justice at its best is the gift that just keeps on giving. A gift that propelled me from a displaced persons camp in Germany to becoming the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court of Canada. My life started in a country where there had been no democracy, no rights, no justice. No one with this history does not feel lucky to be alive and free. No one with this history takes anything for granted. And no one with this history does not feel that we have a particular duty to wear our identities with pride and to promise our children we will do everything humanly possible to keep the world safer for them than it was for their grandparents. A world where all children, regardless of race, color, religion, or gender, can wear their identities with dignity, pride, and in peace. A world, in other words, where the moral arc of the universe always bends towards justice. Thank you.
I've been coming here over 40 years, and I think I have heard one of the most inspirational talks in the life I've never heard. Is it, how do you select your judges in Canada to prevent what is going to be happening to us?
I think it's obvious that we're selected on merit. Writing a dissent, I can tell you from experience, is just as hard as writing a majority opinion. I mean, writing is hard. You know you're not writing for your colleagues anymore because usually by the time you take your pen in hand, and I still take pen in hand, it's not going to be the majority opinion. So you have to believe if you're going to invest in that much time, because the world is not waiting to read everything you write, that it's important to record what your views are. Korematsu, the Dissent by Jackson and Korematsu, for me as a person, as a student of Supreme Court decisions, was a reminder that there was an approach to law and justice that I felt comfortable with on the Supreme Court. If you'd had a system the way the French have, where there are no dissents, I wouldn't be able to identify what the individual decision maker feels in the deliberative process. So we have some colleagues who like to dissent a lot. No, it isn't filled up half full, it's really 2/3 full. I mean, that, I don't know where they get the energy to do that work, but it is not unfamiliar to us to have a dissent of 20 years ago become the majority. I'll give you two examples that just happened recently. We had 25 years ago a decision of the Supreme Court saying that criminal code provision outlawing assisted dying was constitutional. We changed that 3 years later and said it was unconstitutional to prevent somebody who was intolerably suffering. We did the same thing with the prostitution reference, and we did the same thing in a case involving the right to strike. We said it was protected under the Constitution. 30 years ago they said freedom of association did not include the right to strike. So it takes a lot, we have a test for it, but we built on the dissents in the cases, in those other cases, in knowing our uses. So sometimes when you write a dissent, you're speaking to time, but you have to also acknowledge that there may be nobody listening, so don't do it unless you think it's really important. But I thought the Jackson Karamazov dissent was one of the finest pieces of judicial writing I've ever read.
What would you say is Bobby Jackson's single greatest contribution to the rule of law?
Robert Jackson not only believed that law and justice had a working relationship, he saw justice as the application of law to life. And his humanity in the interpretation and application of law, I think, is luminous. There are very few people who did it as consistently and as effortlessly as he did. It was almost as if he didn't have to explain it. It just came from somewhere inside him. He understood what the role of law was. Now that may be because, unlike you and my son Zach, he didn't go to law school. And may also explain why he's such a good writer. He didn't have to read our stuff. So, but I don't know where it came from. He was a humanist with a rigorous intellect. And he never hesitated to say, this is what the right result is for the people involved. So he got on the ground, but his brain was right up there. What would you say it was?
Chautauqua.
And Chautauqua.